Well, hello. Welcome to the September 2024 edition of Outline, DLA Piper's regular series of planning webinars. We're back after our summer break. I hope all of you have had a good break and have returned to the autumn refreshed and raring to go. It's been a busy period for planning while we've been off air, and that is very much the topic of today. And we have a special edition today for the first time ever. It is not just planning solicitors that are on Outline. We're allowing non-lawyers to come and join the party. So today I'm very pleased to be joined by Gavin Barwell, Lord Barwell, a man who probably doesn't need much introduction to those of us involved in the planning world. Former Member of Parliament, former Planning Minister, former Minister for London, former Chief of Staff to Theresa May from 2017 onwards, and now a member of the House of Lords. Just a few of your titles, Gavin. I'm not going to go into the others, but great. They're the ones that are most relevant, it seems to me, to the topic in hand today. So welcome to you, and thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
And the topic of today is sort of less legal than usual, but probably the biggest change that we've had over the course of the summer is the proposed changes to planning policy at a national level from the new, are they still new, the newish Labour government, who sort of came to power clearly with an agenda around planning, because they moved pretty quickly on planning. So that is the topic of conversation today. As ever, there is a Q&A function on your screen. So if you have questions, please do feel free to ask. If you're watching the live version, probably not if you're watching the recorded version, because we won't answer. But please do ask any questions as we go along. But I think, Gavin, if we sort of kick off, it seems to me, sort of before we get into some of the detail of the changes, I'm taken back to the last time you and I met, which was an event that we did at UK Reef together.
Yep.
And that was sort of before the election was called, and you made a number of sort of observations about what a potential future Labour government might mean for real estate more generally. And it really sort of stuck with me, the point you were making about growth. And where planning fits into growth. So I just sort of thought, actually, worth reminding ourselves of your point around growth. And I think if I can sort of summarize what you said was, the new government's got a challenge. We're spending more than we're earning. We don't want to put up tax. We don't want to cut spending. And Liz Truss has demonstrated successfully that borrowing is not necessarily the answer to squaring that circle. And so growth is at the heart of what the government's done. And in all fairness to you, that's exactly what the government's been talking about ever since, it seems to me, is growth, growth, growth. And your point was that when asked the question of the officials in the Treasury, how do we get growth and get it fast? Options 1 and 2 would be rejoining the single market or massively increasing skilled immigration into the country. Neither of those would be terribly appetizing to a new administration. And option 3 would be to get the planning system working. Well done. That appears to be a prediction that's come true, because on the very first sort of proper working day, I suppose, of this Parliament, planning was at the heart of what they were trying to do. So that does seem to me that what you were saying there is absolutely right, and seems to be carrying through into policy.
Yeah, I think if you think back to how Keir Starmer sort of tried to frame things when he was leader of the opposition, I suppose his big idea was about these missions that he talks about. That public policy has been too short-termist in recent years with all the chopping and changing of governments and ministers, and that we need to focus on a few kind of long-term problems that the country faces. And I think when you look at the 5 missions that he published, if you were being a bit cynical, you might say, well, the 5 subjects were chosen by an opinion pollster. They're the 5 issues that voters tend to say they care most about: the economy, health service, education, the environment, and crime. Whereas I think if you were having a more academic exercise and said, well, what are the real long-term crises the country is facing, the housing crisis would definitely be there. But it doesn't really matter, because actually housing and planning fit in, as you were saying, under that growth agenda, essentially. That they view this issue very much through the prism of how to get the economy moving again. You get Britain building again, then that's one of the ways in which you can stimulate economic activity. And it's not just about housing, it's also about commercial development, data centers, warehousing, logistics, and some of the big bits of national infrastructure that we're going to need in relation to the green transition. So yeah, I think that has been entirely vindicated in terms of what they've done in this first 100 days period. You would say probably the planning changes are one of the biggest and one of the most warmly welcomed things that they've done in this initial period.
Mm. And I think you've probably identified the three key topics there that we need to sort of pick up on during the course of the next 50 minutes or so. So sort of you've got housing, you've got commercial development, and particularly some of that sort of nationally significant forms of development, data centers, gigafactories, etc., and then infrastructure. And there's obviously a link between all of those. But I think that growth agenda, just before we get into the detail of that, I think there's an interesting point there, because it feels to me it's reminiscent of sort of 2012 when we saw the very first NPPF. And my view at that time was that it felt as if it was a document. Obviously, Greg Clark, as the minister, had his name on it. But it was always interesting to me that it wasn't Eric Pickles, as the Secretary of State, who had his name on that document. And it very much felt to me as if we'd had the financial crisis, we were going into austerity, we had a government that was left a fairly challenging economic situation. It felt as if planning policy at that point was to a large extent sort of being driven by the Treasury, driven by that economic function. And it feels as if we're back there again. And I suppose for me, the benefit of that back in 2012, and potentially a benefit that we will see here, is perhaps a bit more certainty in decision taking when it's conducted at the appeal level. Come back to local authorities later, but at appeal, we had a period after 2012 where there was quite a lot of certainty, and you could use an appeal as a sensible business strategy, knowing that if you were having trouble at a local level, you could get a high degree of confidence. And it seems to me we may be in a phase. How long that phase lasts, there is potentially an opportunity to see an appeal as a credible, sensible, predictable part of any strategy to bring forward development. And that sort of therefore requires a bit of a refocusing of emphasis, because we as those involved in development, it's planning for planning's sake. We live and breathe planning. We worry about the details of planning, but actually the decision makers they're not bothered about planning for planning's sake. They're not bothered about development really for development's sake. What they want to see is, how are these applications, how are these developments going to drive forward that growth, and how are they going to drive forward that growth quickly enough to avoid tax cuts, tax rises rather, or spending cuts. I think is that a fair point?
It's completely fair. The politicians are very much kind of outcome orientated in what they're looking at here. And you're going to see the problem in this budget that's coming on the 30th of October. Because obviously what you can't do as a government, there's nothing you can do where you press a button and the growth arrives immediately in the next few weeks. So to the extent that there's an immediate problem that she has to fix on the 30th of October, she's going to have to fix that either through cuts, borrowing, or tax rises. And those things are going to be politically unpalatable. And it's just going to reinforce in their minds, this is not a sustainable long-term strategy. And I think whatever I guess people listening to this will have a variety of, in terms of their own personal political views, but most people in this country, I think, believe that the tax burden is fairly near its limit. And if you look at historical standards, the tax burden at the moment is high. So there's not a lot of room for what a Labour government might traditionally do, which is say, well, we'll tax a bit more and we'll be able to spend a bit more that way. If you want to address the poor state of our public services and get some more resource into them, you've got to get the growth. And I think the political difficulties they've had over the winter fuel payments and that they're going to have over this budget will just reinforce this view that we've got to drive really hard at this really quickly, get the new NPPF in place very quickly, and then demonstrate exactly as you're saying in the decisions that we're taking on the applications that cross our desks, that we really mean what we're saying. And one of the things that's really interested me over the summer is to see this sort of YIMBY group of Labour MPs forming, who are sort of saying, look, we know this is going to be politically unpopular with some of our constituents, but this is vital. And actually, we can't have a Labour government saying we want development, we want development, we want development, but Labour MPs locally saying, yeah, but not that one, and not that scheme, and not that scheme there.
Yeah. It's always that challenge, isn't it? Everybody wants housing, particularly as long as it's nowhere near them.
Yeah. I mean, all politics is local in that sense.
And yeah, but actually, fair play to any politician that's actually going to provide leadership and,
Yeah,
and to be willing to say this is a good thing, despite the sort of the local concerns that might be there. So that would it would make a change not to have the local MP trot up at a planning inquiry and just sort of read from the script written by the local objecting association or whoever it happens to be. So it'd be nice to see them positively turn up and go, yes, we need this.
exactly.
So well, let's have a look at housing. What a good place to start is housing. So 1.5, 1.6 million homes in this parliament. It's a challenge.
Yeah, I don't think they'll hit that target, purely because they're starting from such a low base.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think you may well get under 200,000 in the first year, and that means you've got to really ramp up very high by the last year to hit the target. So I'm pretty skeptical about their ability to do that. And we may not get onto all of this on this call, but it's not, to me, this issue is not just about planning policy. It's then about the resourcing of the planning system and its ability to cope with the volume of what's coming through. And it's then about, have you got the people out there to actually do the building, both the range of firms and also then just the construction workers. I mean, I think one of the problems they're going to run into here is the supply of labor to actually do the work. And just to touch on that very briefly, you were talking about how it feels that this is a sort of Treasury dominated period again. I can tell you that when I was housing minister, the argument that goes on within government, which doesn't often get into the public domain, is that the Treasury basically thinks that the reason we haven't built enough homes in this country is the planning system. It thinks that the state has essentially nationalised development control and not released enough land in the right places, and that's why we haven't got the homes we need. The department, whatever you want to call it, Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local, I lose track of the name iterations, but the department responsible for housing policy doesn't completely disagree with that. It agrees that planning reform is needed, but it doesn't think that's the only problem. It thinks there's also a problem in terms of capacity. There's a sort of broken market that isn't capable of delivering the numbers that we need. And that was, when I was doing the job, that was the kind of argument that was going on before the white paper that came out in early 2018 about, well, this doesn't have to be an either or thing. This doesn't have to be, it's either the planning system or it's this, can't we accept that there might be, both of these things might be a problem at the same time?
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to me when you look back throughout sort of the history of us having a planning system, certainly since the Second World War, the only time we've delivered at the sorts of levels that the government's talking about, so 370,000 homes a year plus, has been when there's been a massive public sector housing program alongside a private sector housing program, and it seems to me that is a debate that is yet to happen. It'd be interesting to see the proposals talk about sort of new towns and those sorts of things. Well, the new towns were delivered by the public sector in terms of actually putting them in. Okay, the private housing was delivered by the private sector, but that was very much led by the Commission for New Towns, English Partnerships, as it became, and then the various development corporations. So it'll be interesting to see whether there is that appetite to see the public sector take a much greater involvement in delivery as well as consenting. It's the two things.
I completely agree with you. And I would add two thoughts to your thought, which is that in the period when the public sector was delivering those volumes, it was because the subsidy was directed at bricks and mortar and not at individual people through the benefit system. And so there's a question about whether you want to go back to doing that. The other observation I would make to you is that in the periods historically when we have got close to delivering those numbers, we also had a house builder industry that wasn't dominated by a small number of big players. We had a big SME sector that was delivering a chunk of the numbers in addition to the major house builders. And in the last 2 or 3 recessions, we've seen significant shrinkage of that SME sector. And I don't think you're going to reach those numbers unless you do something actively to rebuild that. And maybe you've got an advantage right now which is you also have an emergent build to rent sector, which could make a contribution to the overall numbers more than it's doing at the moment if public policy shifted a bit to encourage that. But you're going to need multiple providers across multiple tenures to get to the kinds of numbers that the government is talking about. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely. So in terms of sort of some of the changes that are proposed, I mean, the one that for me sits at the heart of the housing changes is not just a return to the standard method for calculating housing numbers, but actually an enhanced standard method and an absolute obligation that it will be the standard method, and without what sort of we've seen in the past of the ability for local authorities to justify an alternative approach if local circumstances allow. That seems to me to be a change that will make quite a fundamental difference in terms of how it sits within the tilted balance and the sort of presumption in favour of sustainable development of paragraph 11. If you get the housing numbers right, the rest of the framework, which is what we had in 2011 and what was 2012 rather, and what we've moved away from in more recent versions of the framework, is having that absolute number to start with against which everything else can be applied. So that seems to me to be something that the industry will welcome. I'm not sure necessarily local communities, local planning authorities will be universally welcoming of that, because it does have some quite severe consequences in terms of housing numbers across large parts of the country, particularly where development is most controversial, being sort of the southeast, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I'm obviously sympathetic to this because this is when I was housing minister, we introduced the revised methodology that upped the numbers. And yeah, I think you can see very clearly what the impact of Michael Gove reversing that policy and allowing some local authorities off the hook has been. That if you don't have that element of compulsion in there, there are a bunch of local authorities that will not build the level of housing that we need. And I think it's quite interesting to see the government taking this approach, because absent housing policy, when you hear them talk, they talk a very good game about devolution and local decision making. But they have recognized that in this area, if you want to build 300,000 plus homes a year, you've got to actually force local authorities to do their bit. Because if you don't do that, the reality is a whole chunk of them will not do so. So I think it is the most consequential change that they're making, the most important one. You can argue a little bit about the detail of the methodology. The numbers for London come down quite a bit, and the government has sort of said, well, the London number was just unrealistic, and this is a more realistic target. I think some people might say, actually, if you look at affordability, London is the place where the crisis is most acute, and we shouldn't be letting the Mayor of London off the hook quite so much. But that is an argument in the detail. The principle that you're talking about, which is essentially having a clearly assessed national figure of what we require from each local area and making sure that plans have to deliver that, I think is a really, really important reform.
Yeah. And sort of without getting into the detail, I think you're right in London, but a move away from the Gove forcing into urban areas and trying to pretend, frankly, that the urban areas could drive up delivery so as to compensate for letting the I don't know, is it rural areas or Tory shires? Not sure which is the most appropriate phrase to use.
They're not all Tory shires now, obviously.
No, they're not. Well, they're not anymore, are they? But yeah, letting them off the hook, that has gone. But I think I certainly welcome the sort of tightening up of the standard method, giving you your base number, but then having the uplift applied to sort of push numbers, but equally then linking to affordability, so that if you're in an area where affordability is particularly acute, your number's going to go up beyond the standard method. I don't think that gets to the right level necessarily in London, but I think elsewhere, particularly some of those southeast areas, that link to affordability, when we used to have it, even in a more watered down form, actually was quite a powerful driver of sort of pushing up those numbers even beyond what the method was coming up with in the first place.
Yeah, and maybe again it's useful just to expose the internal arguments that go on within government. So when we were drawing up the methodology for the housing white paper in early 2018, The Treasury had the purest view, essentially, which is where you start with the household projections. The government has gone a different way. It started with a kind of percentage uplift on the existing housing stock. But you start with a number, and then the market is telling you where the housing crisis is most acute by the price you have to pay for housing, and therefore you have an affordability adjustment, and that gives you the number. Theresa um, was worried that all that did was to concentrate all the housing in London and the southeast, and that was inconsistent with what later became to be known as levelling up. That if you were trying to have a more balanced UK economy, that you wanted to ensure that housing development was spread more evenly around the country. And the Treasury's counter to that was, well, you can set Cumbria a target to build tens and tens of thousands of homes, but the reality is the market's not going to build those homes because there isn't the demand for it there. And so in the end, we came up with a methodology that made a bit of an adjustment from the kind of purist affordability case, but ultimately was driven by that. And I think that's the right thing to do. Ultimately, those house prices are telling you where demand is hot, and the planning system should respond to a degree to that in terms of where we're building.
Yeah. We've had a question come through, which is sort of I think linked. Now's probably a good time to bring it in, which is around consultation. And you're being asked your view on the level of consultation, public consultation in particular, that is appropriate. And I suppose sort of the question kind of triggers in my mind a thought. It takes me back to the last Labour government, well, what we used to call the new Labour government, but now we've got a newer Labour government, so I'm not sure what they call it anymore. But their white paper at the beginning of the process that led to the 2004 Act, sort of in the prime ministerial forward, I think it was, said, in reforming the planning system, we have two objectives: increase delivery, speed up the process, and increase public participation. And I kind of thought from the very beginning they were doomed, because you can't achieve both those things at once. They're mutually incompatible, I think. Interesting that sort of public consultation, public participation, it's in the written ministerial statement, but it feels as if there's less of a focus, to me at least, on that public consultation. So I just invite you to respond to the question around what the right level is, but also, is there a bit of a sort of move away perhaps from localism as it's been sort of branded over the last decade or so?
I think a bit, yes. I mean, I think that the right point for public consultation is in plan development. I mean, I say this, really going back to my time when I was a local councillor. It was extraordinarily frustrating in that people would come to you upset about a particular planning application, and you'd go away and look at the local plan and think, well, this application is consistent with the plan. So I've got as your local representative, I can go along and make your arguments, but I've got very little chance of winning, because actually this should be given permission. And really, your concerns should have been addressed to the council at the point where it was thinking about putting this planning policy in the plan, essentially. So I think what we need to do as a country is it is important that people have a significant input into how their communities develop and evolve over time. But we should be trying to drive that consultation into the development of plan policies. And what we want from the planning system is actually a much quicker system, where if applications are consistent with planning policy, we want them to go through very quickly and not be debated, have the same arguments every time, because they were settled at the point that the planning policies were agreed. So that's what I would try and do. And I think that feels like that's the direction that the government is going.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's harder to get individuals. Actually, sometimes it's hard to get clients to engage at the plan making stage, because unless you've got an actual live site, you don't engage. And if you don't have a planning application at the end of your road, you're less likely to engage. So I think there's a challenge, but I completely agree. That's the right place to do it. Once you've got your plan, we shouldn't keep revisiting the same arguments over and over again. But I sort of sense that sort of comes back to my part of the government solution to that is perhaps to create a sort of playing field where the appeal system is more predictable, and therefore actually, even if that local debate is ultimately driving local decisions. And I think I'm always keen to remind clients, at the end of the day, people don't get elected as councillors. And you've been a councillor, I've been a councillor. People don't get elected to be a local councillor in order to carry out the quasi-judicial function of a planning committee. They get elected because they want to represent their people, they're passionate about their community. And so we can all be and are intensely frustrated by political decisions being made at local level. But if you ask local level politicians to make decisions, you can't really blame them when they bring in that politics. The release valve for that is having an appeal system that is quick and predictable to overcome. And I sort of wonder whether there is a little element. It worked. Planning by appeals sort of worked in the 80s. It sort of worked in the early 2010s with the early framework. I wonder whether that's sort of where the government sees cutting through some of that local objection is at appeal level, rather than particularly thinking there's much you can do to depoliticize the local decision.
Yeah, I agree. And I think they have this view more generally about policy as a whole, not just in the planning space. That if you want growth, if you want people to invest in the UK, if you want businesses to take decisions to get on with things, then what you want is public policy that is predictable, which is both stable, not being tinkered with and changed all the time, and the businesses can see how that's going to operate and work through, so they've got certainty, or as much as possible, about what's going to work and what's not, essentially. And as you say, sometimes you're always going to get a degree of local politics in planning, but if the appeal system functions effectively, then that's a safety valve.
Yeah. Just sort of moving on, I think one of the other big changes for me in housing is around affordable housing, and sort of a tidying up perhaps of what had become quite cumbersome in terms of first home, starter homes, and this sort of more and more prescription coming into the framework around what you had to include in your affordable housing mix. Moving away from that and just going back to allowing local authorities to set their tenure mix for affordable housing, that seems a sensible step, because it just felt to me it all got too complicated when you were trying to accommodate everything else. But alongside that, much greater emphasis on social rent,
Yeah.
without any discussion around how social rent is going to be funded, because historically social rent has only ever been delivered when there's been grant funding in one form or another going into the system. So I wonder what are the sort of where's the direction of travel around delivery of and making social rent part of the mix again and making it affordable to bring it back in.
Yeah, not clear. So I think there's two things here, aren't there? There's a little bit of a tension between the two things you've just described. Generally, the thrust of policy is towards simplification and not being prescriptive about what types of affordable housing are going to be delivered. But then on the specific issue of social rent, there is a little bit of but we want more social rent. And then there, I think there isn't clarity to the question you've asked me directly, which is how is all that going to be funded? We'll probably have to wait for the budget, the funding settlement for the next year or two, and maybe even for the spending review in the spring, to see whether the government is really going to deliver a step change in the subsidy that it's driving into the system, which is what you actually would need to drive more affordable housing. And I think the danger here, and you might come on and ask me about this in a second, so I won't say too much about it, but also in terms of the 50% figure in relation to greenbelt land that's afforded, is you can put policies in place, but if there isn't a mechanism to make them deliverable, then actually you don't get the homes that you want.
Yeah. And we are going to come on the green belt in a minute. You'll be unsurprised here. But I think one of the other things I'd say about some of the affordable housing changes is there's also, we always need to be careful about sort of stymieing innovation. And what works for a traditional sort of private build to sell scheme doesn't work with build to rent. And it doesn't necessarily work for elderly housing care, those sorts of areas. And I think there's not enough in there for me around actually recognizing that local authorities might have their preferred tenure mix and everything else, but if you want to bring in these more innovative products, the sort of specialist asset classes that we're seeing, and the institutional money that's following them in, which is a new means of delivery in itself, is bringing it's a new source of funding coming into housing. You've got to take a much more flexible view around what affordable housing is. Social rent in a build to rent scheme, I struggle to see how that even begins to work. It feels to me as if that's not yet landed as a point that sort of hit the consciousness of MHCLG.
Yeah, I think where government gets into trouble is where it has an objective, but it doesn't have the money to do it. So it tries to lever it into something else,
Mm.
right? If really what you're about here is trying to build 300,000 homes a year, or maybe even a bit more than that, to get you 1.5 million over the total of the Parliament, you really need these innovative new forms to make a contribution to that. And you've got to be very careful that because you don't have the money to deliver the affordable you want, you try and impose requirements in the planning system to get it for you. And actually, what you end up doing is reducing the total volume of development that you get. It's completely counterproductive. So I think there is significant risk there. It's one of the things that would worry me.
Yeah. And sort of a green belt, no session on planning policy and planning reform would be complete without tackling the controversial issue, the third rail of planning. I would suggest that it's that is greenbelt, but they have, in fairness, they've grasped that issue, and I think there's a few points. We'll come on to grey belt in a minute, but sort of housing and greenbelt first. I think a recognition that if you can't meet your housing numbers, you must review your greenbelt as part of your plan making process. A real tightening up there of making it clear that there is a link, and you've got to, if you can't meet it by other means, whether that's pushing it out to neighbouring authorities or whether it's delivery within your existing settlements, you've got to review greenbelt. With the only caveat being, unless that has an impact at a council area level, which I think is quite interesting, because it always seems to me it's quite hard to show an area-wide impact in that way. You can always show an impact on a particular part of the greenbelt, a particular community, a particular settlement, but to actually show that a release of greenbelt land will affect the borough, the district, whatever it is as a whole, particularly in a unitary authority, which is a much bigger scale, that seems to me a real sort of strengthening of the ability through local plans to push for greenbelt release to deliver housing numbers.
Definitely, unarguably. And I think where they've ended up is quite similar to where my old boss, Saj David, wanted to get to. But number 10 were nervous on the greenbelt issue, the third rail point that you make, and ultimately blocked that from going in the white paper.
Yeah. Then with some of the detail, and this sort of does come into the 50%, some clarity where you are delivering in the green belt, some quite stringent requirements actually as to what you've got to deliver in terms of delivering the infrastructure that's needed, but also quite a strong policy presumption towards delivering 50% affordable housing. Now that obviously has a viability impact. I think we probably have to consider that alongside the very clear sort of move to limit what a landowner can expect to receive in terms of land value in the green belt, and I wonder whether one is meant to make the other affordable. But
that's the idea, yeah.
So some viability challenges there, it seems to me.
Yeah, I mean, we have to see how that plays out. I think that the grey belt concept is a good one. I mean, one of the things that has made this green belt issue so toxic over the years is that most people think of the green belt as an environmental policy, and it's not. It's an anti-sprawl policy. And I always used to, when I was trying to persuade people when I was housing minister to look at this issue, I always used to cite an example from my constituency. So I represented Croydon Central, right on the southern edges of Greater London, so strips of greenbelt land along the southern edge of the constituency. And one example, you go down this road, and there's a massive car scrapyard that is a greenbelt site. And if you ask the people that live in that area, could we buy up that scrapyard, close it, and replace it with 200 or 300 homes, they would bite your hands off to do that, because the disruption, the lorries that are taking the stuff, and the noise, it really spoils what would otherwise be a lovely little valley running up into the North Downs. So I definitely think the principle that there are pockets of land in the green belt that you could absolutely develop without in any way impacting either sprawl or environmental quality is unarguable, in my opinion. I agree with you that the problem with this policy is whether this 50% requirement, nearly, or certainly strong, push for 50% affordable, whether that is going to impact the viability of the schemes and mean that you don't actually get the outcome that you're trying to get out of this. I think there's quite a lot of concern among the developers about how that's going to work.
And I think ultimately you can through policy try to limit what a landowner is entitled to, but ultimately the landowner doesn't want to sell. The landowner doesn't want to sell, and so there is always that challenge. Compulsory purchase is an area that if we get too far into it, we'll be here for far too long, and we need to come on to stuff because we're running out of time already. But I sort of this suggestion of limiting hope value for greenbelt sites through CPO. It's something that actually Oliver Letwin sort of talked about in his policy paper a few years ago now. So, and actually Theresa May in the 2017 manifesto,
Yeah.
which is controversial now and not seen as most successful, but there was some interesting stuff there around sort of taking out hope value from CPO. It feels as if that might be how they're trying to square that circle, but and with a sort of policy requirement here that's saying that actually local authorities, the HCA, should use CPO powers to assist a developer where they've got a scheme that simply can't be brought forward because a landowner wants an unrealistic value. So I wonder whether there's a thought that sort of developers and the public sector end up sort of collaborating to effectively sort of cut the landowner negotiation out where you can't get the value to work in order to deliver.
Yeah, I think this is true both on some greenfield sites. You know, there's a strong argument, in my opinion, to say that where the state takes a bit of agricultural land or land that doesn't have any, permission to develop on and shifts its designation, it can't be right that the landowner gets a massive windfall out of that. It must be right that some of that gets captured to fund either the infrastructure that is necessary to fund the scheme or it's a contribution to affordable housing. So I think there's a fairly wide cross-party agreement that we should be doing something about that. You also, I think, have got without getting us into the, as you say, the depth of the CPO argument. I think you've also got to look at speed, because for these schemes to work, we talked about this earlier. You need certainty, and you need confidence about timescales. And in my experience, again, my experience as a constituency MP, CPOs can be very long, drawn-out processes. So if they're going to go down this road of CPO reform, I would be quite an enthusiastic supporter of that. But that's not going to provide. You've got primary legislation required that you've got to get through to do that. It's not going to provide immediate answers in the near future. And if they make the change to the MPF in terms of the 50%, like before Christmas, absent that CPO answer, then I think the 50% is definitely a problem.
Yeah. I'm going to use the grey belt as our link into commercial development, because that doesn't have to, when being delivered on the grey belt, won't have to deliver 50% affordable housing. So it seems to me, coming back to that growth agenda, there's a real recognition in the economic changes that are being proposed to the framework of the need, not just perhaps to meet the sort of local needs. Who traditionally local plans have said, we've got this many houses, that means we get this many new people needing jobs, therefore we need this much economic space. Actually, it feels as if there's perhaps a move away from that and a recognition that local authorities, some more than others, will have a role to play in some of these nationally important developments. Data centres is probably the one closest to my heart, because I've got one of the appeals that's currently before the Secretary of State on what is clearly grey belt site, or would be if the policy was already in place. But data centres, gigafactories, labs, those things are going to fuel the knowledge economy, going to fuel the sectors of the future. And where actually you might not be able to show a need for a gigafactory in X local authority or a data centre in X local authority, but UK PLC needs these things to happen. It feels as if there's quite strong support coming in for getting these things into local plans and then getting them delivered, and potentially using the grey belt to do that where it's necessary.
Yeah, I think what's interesting here, this is always a problem in government, which is what order do you do things? So because they've gone hard at planning right at the start, this has come out quite early. But what we're clearly going to get at some point in the next few months is an industrial strategy that sets out which are the sectors of the economy that the government thinks are the ones that are going to drive growth in the UK. And I suspect that document is then going to say we want sort of sub-regional industrial strategies that link into this document and identify within a particular, maybe a mayoral combined authority area or whatever, which are the sectors in that local economy from this national strategy and where are the opportunities. And then maybe local growth plans at local authority, unitary authority level that then fit into the sub-regional ones. So they're sort of running at the planning thing until we've had clarity on some of the industrial policy. But I think you can see what's going on here, which is exactly as you say, to say we may have some national priorities that we want reflected in all local plans, and we may have some sub-regional priorities that individual local authorities have to do. And it's not just about your local economic needs. That's definitely the sort of sense that you get from reading the document.
Yeah.
But we haven't yet had the industrial policy in terms of how that's all going to actually link together.
No, no. And that's clearly part of the jigsaw that we need, isn't it? But it's interesting. They're using phrases like critical national infrastructure in the context of data centers, gigafactories. That's strong stuff.
Yeah.
That's strong stuff, and particularly on an appeal, an inspector's going to put a lot of weight on that.
Yeah.
It's hard to ignore your boss's policy when they're describing these things as critical. That seems to me there are some really interesting opportunities there for delivering some of this development, which can be really controversial, and quite a lot of it. Data centers is the classic example where a lot of the places that are attractive to place data centers are in greenbelt areas. The West London sort of Slough Hillingdon corridor there, and Buckinghamshire sitting at the heart of that, is an area where that is a sensible place to meet a significant amount of the need for data centers, which is just exponentially going through the roof as we look at AI and everything else that's coming forward. So some interesting stuff there, and I think the industry sort of needs to be thinking about how they engage with local plans in order to make sure that those needs are being flagged and are being identified in local planning policy, which is not something that traditionally those sort of specialist sectors have been as good at as, say, the house building lobby through the HBF and others. There's a sort of an obligation that comes with some of this, I think, on some of those sectors to really think about how they engage in plan making to make sure that they're getting those planning policies at local level in those areas where they might not have a site yet, but where that's the logical place to start looking for sites.
Completely agree. And look, I'll give you another example, which is was National Grid. I mean, I've been talking about this privately to people for the last year or two. I'm hugely concerned about this because if you step back for a second and think about the energy transition and what we're trying to do, we're not only trying to turn the way we generate electricity in this country from fossil fuels into renewables, but we're also massively increasing the amount of electricity that we need because we're going to heat our homes with electricity rather than with gas. We're going to power our cars with electricity rather than petrol or diesel. So you're going to have a very significant expansion of what you need. And at the moment, I'm sure you do a bit as well, I come across house builders who are told you can't build homes in that area because there isn't the grid connection available. People trying to develop data centers being told you can't do it there because there isn't the grid capacity to serve you. People that have built new energy generating capacity and it can't yet be connected to the grid. So a national grid would say to you, well, the planning system's a major blocker to us, right? So they're going to have to really engage with local authorities about what is it that we're going to need to make all of this work in your area.
Yeah.
And again, it's not just about the local need, because some of this is going to be sort of roots. I'm not an expert in this, but someone described it to me as almost like completely rewiring the system of this country, because historically what you've had is fossil fuel power stations, normally in the north of the country, and bring the energy down the spine of the country to London and the south. Whereas now a lot of this stuff is going to come in off the East Coast. You've got to rewire the whole thing. And a lot of what's going to be required isn't to serve Lincolnshire or East Yorkshire, but it's conduits to get it where it needs to be.
Yeah. And I think gigafactories, data centers is a good example of that. These are hugely energy intensive.
Yeah.
And so they have an impact on a grid that isn't designed. We've got infrastructure that's designed to get electricity into homes, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
what it's there for. And it's interesting, and this probably links to the third issue you referred to at the beginning of infrastructure. I think policies are recognizing that it's no good being pro a data center or pro a good gigafactory. You've got to think about the infrastructure, and planning policy and local policies, local authorities have got to be alive to the importance of delivering that infrastructure and consenting that infrastructure in order to facilitate those things. I mean, data centers is a classic example where my housing clients issue number one when they're looking at a site is planning in terms of what are the potential impediments. Planning is always there. Actually, for a data center client, planning is important, but it's issue number two. Planning number one is power. Where are we going to get the power from? And you've got these sorts of development which actually have the opportunity to deliver significant infrastructure investment. If they will pay for that new substation. But what you need is a planning authority that is prepared to consent that new infrastructure, and indeed a system that is able to accommodate that investment in a timely way and delivery of that infrastructure in the right way. But I think it's a positive first step for me that the planning policy is being proposed that recognises that it is chicken and egg with those two. And you've got to have that conversation in a very joined up way.
And just take a step back, look at some of these issues from the government's point of view. The government has got a target of moving the electricity generation system to clean energy by 2030. And that's an extraordinarily ambitious target. Most people don't think it can be done, but they've put themselves on the political hook to do that. You get these schemes through the contracts for difference process. We've just had the sixth allocation round. They need them built really quickly. Politically, they're also on the hook on sewage discharges, right? They've hammered the previous government on that. Voters are going to look at the data in 5 years' time and say, well, is there a significant step change? So they need the new infrastructure to prevent those discharges built very, very quickly. There's also, I think, some maybe not as politically acute, but some big questions for the country about reservoirs, in terms of water capacity as our population grows. So you can see the pressures on the government to try and speed up the delivery of this infrastructure that are driving the changes that you then see in the consultation document that we've seen.
But one of the things that it alarms me a little bit is the sort of references to the development consent order regime as sort of potentially being the silver bullet here. And I'm thinking particularly around sort of data centers, gigafactories, labs, and a suggestion that they're moved into the NSIP regime. Now, I think I can see there's a difference, it seems to me, between what they're proposing in the framework and what is said in the written ministerial statement about this. The framework talks about the DCO regime being available to a particular promoter of a data center or gigafactory or whatever, if they wish it, but leaving that decision very much with the promoter of a particular scheme. The ministerial statement is talking about sort of redefining some of these areas as being NSIPs, and once the legal consequence of that is once you're defined as an NSIP, you have to use the DCO regime. Yeah. I think we do a lot of infrastructure consenting here at DLA. We do a lot of DCOs within my team. They're great. They're hugely powerful weapons, particularly when you need land assembly. So you need compulsory purchase powers. They work very well for a sort of linear scheme where you've got those sorts of issues. They also work where you need other orders around your planning because you can roll it all into the one process. So there are a number of advantages to it, but it is not by any means a quick or indeed a cheap process. And so I think if you take a data center, for example, land assembly is not usually an issue because they're relatively small sites. And usually you're dealing with a landowner, perhaps a couple of landowners, and that deal can be done quite quickly. You don't need CPO powers. There aren't necessarily other complicated orders that needs to run alongside it. If suddenly all data centers are NSIPs, then you're not going to deliver another one for 2 or 3 years while you bring forward DCOs under that regime. So it seems to me there's a real danger in the government getting a little trigger happy with seeing DCOs and NSIPs as that silver bullet, because they do have the potential to actually slow down delivery of some of this stuff, in contrast to a planning system that has certainty on appeal. And I keep making this point, I suppose I keep coming back to it, but if we've got certainty on appeal, if we've got grey belt type policies in place, actually an application and, if necessary, an appeal can get you to a DC consent or a gigafactory consent or whatever quite much quicker than a DCO would potentially. So I think I would encourage the government to, yes, give everybody the option of reaching for the DCO tool if they need to, but not necessarily forcing these emerging sectors into it, because that has the risk to me of slowing down delivery and achieving actually precisely the opposite of what they're trying to do.
So I very strongly agree with that. I think you're much better letting developers decide which of the routes is going to work best for them. And actually, it might help them sometimes with local authorities that they can kind of say to the local authority, obviously, if you're going to make this really difficult, we have this other option available to us, right? But I wouldn't close off option one and push it all through option two. And I'd add a second concern to the one that you've set out in relation to timing, which is if you get a significant increase in the numbers that are going through that route, I would have concerns about the government's capacity to deal with all of that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. We've had a couple of comments coming in around sort of whether you can already put a DC through a DCO. There's too many DCs in that. Whether you can put a data center through a DCO, and of course you can. Any commercial development, commercial business development can apply under Section 35. And I don't think the government's proposing any legal changes to that. I think all they're trying to do in the framework is to sort of flag in advance that they will be open to designating schemes as schemes under Section 35. So I think there's not a change to the legal position being proposed in the framework. There's simply, I think, a bit of sort of red flagging in politics.
Right? It's some advertising.
Yeah, it is, and kind of almost inviting people, if they think it's useful, to come and do it. And that seems to be quite powerful, because there hasn't been a lot of guidance up to now on what the criteria the government will apply when thinking about whether to use its Section 35 powers or not. So that nod to particular sectors is useful, but leaving, as you say, option 1 and 2 on the table feels the right approach. We are very close to time, Gavin. We always have we finish on the hour, if not before, so we're not keeping people going. So I'll try and we've had some questions. One question which I haven't really looked at here, but and quite an open question. Do you have any thoughts on the New Towns Task Force?
Not strong ones. No, I mean, I think the New Town stuff is very good and the right thing to do, but it's not going to solve the government's problems in this Parliament. And I think sometimes politicians seize on this. The reality with these new settlements is they take a long time to build out. So I'm all in favour of it. I think it's good long-term policy. And to be fair to the government, one of the things the Prime Minister has said very clearly is he wants to take this kind of longer-term view. But clearly, in terms of the immediate pressures they're on for numbers in this Parliament, none of that is likely to make much of a contribution at all.
No. We've had another question over sort of tension with sort of existing safeguarding for minerals and waste sites, some of which potentially are those grey belt sites, or some of the grey belt sites that we were talking about earlier. I mean, I think I don't see in any of the changes an undermining of that safeguarding, and where there are those sites, it seems to me that sort of will still be a factor that needs to be thought about in any planning application. But I don't know whether you have other thoughts on that.
No, it's not something anyone's mentioned to me before. I mean, I agree with you. We'll have to sort of see how the system works once it's gone through and it operates. But I don't see anything in the consultation document that would ring any alarm bells to me.
No. So I think that recognition that those sites are important, and that because ultimately, if we're going to drive the development, we need the resources to come from somewhere, and it's not terribly sustainable or viable to bring it in from far afield. So I think we will continue to see the minerals and waste planning authorities have that important role in identifying those sites, and making sure that is thought about as plans and applications come forward. The very last one, in the closing sort of 2 minutes or so of the session, a question has come in on plan making, and there's a lot in there which we haven't touched on sort of recognizing that planning authorities need to be resourced up if they're going to deliver all of this. But interesting point that's come out in the question is around transitional arrangements. There is no suggestion in the current draft of the framework that there will be any protections. Some plans are going to be allowed to continue through examination if they're sufficiently advanced in order to get a plan adopted. But I don't see anything in the framework that says that those plans will have any protection. From day one, if you're not delivering to your standard method housing numbers, you will be out of date for housing, for example. You won't have a 5-year land supply, and your plan is immediately vulnerable on adoption. I don't know if you see it differently.
No, I think I see it the same way as you. I think the question, I think there's a number, isn't there? If you're more than a certain number of homes below what your number is, essentially.
Yeah, 200.
I think this is something where local government is going to lobby quite hard in response to the consultation, because the message in there is very clearly that ministers want councils that are mid-process to continue with the plans, but you've got to incentivize that. And you've got to think really carefully as a government about what behaviours you're incentivizing here. And you don't want to offer too long transitional protection because you want the numbers and you want them quickly. But if you don't offer any at all, then there's a danger, I think, that people are going to say, well, what's the point in continuing with this if it's immediately out of date? So I suspect this is one of the areas that will be a focus in the consultation. And I suspect officials have said to ministers, don't offer anything up on this, but this is a kind of, if you wanted to offer a little bit of a sweetener when you're responding to the consultation, this is an area where you could offer something.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've come to the end and we've agreed pretty much throughout. So it's nice we're going to end on a little bit of disagreement. So I think it's a good thing not to have transitional arrangements, because ultimately, if you're serious about it, they're not going to get to 1.5 million by the end of the Parliament. But if you're serious about getting quick delivery, a transitional provision simply slows down and lets local authorities off the hook for a period of time. So the sooner the better if we're serious about delivering that growth and delivering it quickly, for me. But there we are. We finally found somewhere where we're not quite aligned, which is good to know. But we're at the hour. We could probably go on for another hour at least. But we will let our audience go. So, Gavin, if I can just say a big thank you to you. Really appreciate you giving up your time to join us today. As ever, thank you to our audience. I hope it's been useful. And we will be back with our next episode of Outline in October. But in the meantime, thank you to everyone for listening. And again, thank you, Gavin. Goodbye.